Welcome. Today we have a special guest with us. The special guest is Curtis J. Johson. And Curtis J. Johson, you may remember from WDGY back in the late 60s and early 70s, was a newscaster there at that station. And he was also doing some work at WTCN-TV, Channel 11 during the Metro Media days. We are coming to you from the Pavic Museum. We're on the museum's main floor right now. The museum has one of the largest collections of television and radio equipment, and it also has a mission to share with the community the impact that was caused by the pioneers in electronic communication and the evolution on society. The Pavic Museum also sponsors the Minnesota Broadcasting Hall of Fame. And the Minnesota Broadcasting Hall of Fame inducts a number of people into that Hall of Fame every 2 years who have shown a major contribution to the broadcast industry. The Pavic Museum has a website, and that website is pavicmuseum.org. That website also has links to other websites that have recordings of Twin Cities Radio. So there's a pretty good archive of radio history on that site. One of those websites is one that I also co-host with the Pavic Museum called TwinCitiesRadioAirchecks.com. TwinCitiesRadioAirchecks.com has a significant collection of recordings, old photographs, and promotional materials from Twin Cities radio stations, various formats from the 50s, 60s, and 70s primarily, including a newscast that Curtis J. Johson had, and we're going to play about 30 seconds of it right now.
At 20 minutes to 11, this is Curtis J. Johson, WDGY 2020 News. Ron Edwards has been renominated by Minneapolis Mayor Arthur Naftalin to the City Commission on Human Relations. The City Council rejected Edwards the first time on January 12th because he was a police record of criminal offenses. Naftalin says that Edwards, a Negro, is needed to be a spokesman for his part of the Negro community. The mayor also recommended that the Commission on Human Relations be increased from 15 to 21 members.
WDGY weather.
Just ahead of much more music and J.J. Bowman in St. Paul and Minneapolis. Look for cloudy and mild.
What we have today is a discussion with Curtis J. Johson, and we'll hear him talk about his career in radio, and we'll hear him kind of describe it as a series of accidents, although they're not necessarily freeway accidents, but they are fortunate accidents that came along the path of Curtis J. Johson during his career in radio. Curtis, welcome to come here at the Pavic. It was nice to get you here.
Thank you. And it's good to be in a museum and alive.
So we have a lot of old things around us, older than both of us, so that makes me feel good too.
I noticed this says right in front of one that's marked 1927.
Yes.
I
yes.
wasn't around then. Okay.
No. I think we have some other radio displays here back in the 50s that would be more significant for the era.
Recognized it.
Me too. I'm a few years behind you, but not too far. So I came along in broadcasting as you were still working at the WDGY, because I was still in high school at that time.
Excellent.
But anyways, I kind of wanted to kind of cover your career a little bit from the beginning and get into the WDGY background as well. So, you know, I guess it kind of starts where you grew up.
It does, really. A little teeny town in North Dakota called Lisbon, Cheyenne River Valley, and just a very small town, 2,000 people, but a town next to us, Oaks, North Dakota, had a radio station. Mm-hmm. And one year they decided to put a remote studio over in our little hometown on Main Street in the storefront, and asked me to do school news on Saturday morning. Mm-hmm. And I thought, yes, that sounds like fun. The pay was absolutely nothing, but I had more fun than you could shake a stick at.
Yeah.
And it made me very interested in radio.
Yeah. Well, it's good to get a start that way. And even though it was an unpaid start, it was really good, I think, for your interest in broadcasting. After that radio station, I think you attended college.
I did. I went to Valley City State Teachers College, Valley City, North Dakota. Wanted to be a history teacher. Mm-hmm. after a year there, I really wasn't excited to go back.
Oh,
And I literally became a bellhop in a hotel in Fargo Moorhead.
okay.
And I did very well, believe it or not. Doesn't sound like it should be. It's a small town too compared to the Twin Cities, but did very well. And after 1 year there, the bug caught me again, the radio bug. And I decided I got to go to school. And I decided, okay, what's the best radio school I can think of? Brown Institute, Minneapolis.
So that's how you ended up going from Lisbon to Moorhead to the Twin Cities originally,
It
was
is.
to get the education at Brown Institute.
Yes.
How did that all come about at Brown Institute?
Well, I went down and just to check the school out, see what it was like. Went through a little bit of information with the admittings people and the front desk, and we toured the building. This was on Lake Street back in the day, and so forth. And on the way out, we passed an open door where a man was standing, an elderly man at that time. I was 21, and so 20 really. And
Okay.
he said, "Hi, Curt, how you doing? How are things in Lisbon, North Dakota?" Now, I did not know this man. I don't know why he would know me, but it was Brownie, fellow that owned and started Brown Institute.
Richard Brown.
Yes, very much.
Yes. And so that was impressive, I think, for him
Oh,
to
I was-
remember all that.
I was shocked.
Yeah.
He would walk down the halls and talk to students by their first name, and they were from all over the country.
How long did you go to Brown? I think you went to Brown for both broadcasting and electronics, similar to what I did when I went to Brown. I wasn't sure I was going to make it in broadcasting, so I wanted to have a backdrop.
Good idea.
I wanted to have something else to do in case I couldn't be on the radio.
I hear you. I went the other way. I went to broadcast and then electronics. And got a first-class engineer's license.
What year was that?
That would have been late 1963 into 1964.
Okay. Okay. So you got the first class radio telephone license, which they say is your ticket.
Yes.
That's the ticket that was going to earn you an extra maybe $25 or $50 a week when you're in broadcasting. So that's a good thing to have.
Yeah.
And so you had the ticket. And then what accident happened that caused you to get your first job, your first paid job
Yeah.
in radio?
Well, I was in final set of studios. They were called ABC at Brown at that time. And one of the admissions people downstairs came up and took me out of class and said, "We need you to get on a phone call with a gentleman that we've contacted about a job." Okay, so we went down. We were in Brownie's office, as a matter of fact. We called him Brownie. We were in his office, and they dialed up a fellow by the name of George Bigger in DeKalb, Illinois, WLBK radio. And Mr. Bigger owned the station, and they had sent an audition tape, one of the little 1.5 inchers that we had back then, to Mr. Bigger. He listened to it, got on the phone. He said, "Well, I heard your tape, and I like it, and we have a job opening. I'm wondering if you're interested." And we talked for a while, and of course I wanted a job coming out of school and so forth, and it all worked out pretty good. And prior to him saying, "Well, you actually have the job now," he said, "Why did you get a first-class engineer's license? So you could charge me more money?" And I was a little stumped for a second or two, but then, no, Mr. Bigger, what really happened is I figure if I ever work at a directional station, I could use the engineering side as well to sign
Yeah.
the log and so forth.
Yeah.
And he was happy with that, and he hired me.
Well, that's an interesting start. You know, I kind of think about today, it wouldn't necessarily happen that way because they need permission to do everything, so they wouldn't just send out your tape without permission.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure you were thrilled that they did.
Oh, yes.
And,
Yeah.
and how did it feel to get your first offer?
Oh, it felt great, except he asked me one question that almost set me down in the chair, like I said. He said, "Why did you get your license so you could charge me more money?" Because that $75 a week was just the broadcast side. You had another $15 a week if you had a license.
Wow.
And I said, again, the directional station thing.
Making the big bucks
Oh,
back,
yes.
back in the 60s.
Rolling in it.
Well, your job there at the station in DeKalb, the job wasn't necessarily news. It was a radio program playing music.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was an afternoon Music, talk, information, and so forth. They involved the public. I don't think they'd ever had somebody allowing the public to call in and I talked to them on the air and so forth.
Oh, okay.
But we did. And there was a potato chip company in Rockford, Illinois, about 40 miles away. And I can't remember, Blue Star potato chips.
Okay.
I do remember. And we had, in my show, we had a question every day at a certain time, and some ladies would call in, and if I picked up your phone call, I'd ask you to give me a recipe from the back of a Blue Star potato chips package. If they did, I think they got a month's supply of potato chips. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But the phone lines would light up in this town of 30,000 people.
So you were actually one of the first talk radio hosts in the country, I think. Maybe.
Kinda game show.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that job lasted you, I think, a couple years or a year and a half. Year and a half, yeah. And so there must have been another accident somewhere that got you from that station to the station in Cedar Rapids.
Yeah, my life's been an accident, but in radio, there's been really good accidents. There was a group of owners and operators in Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, and managers that met once a year in one of the states and one of the stations. This particular year, they were meeting in DeKalb, Illinois, where I was, and they would take a tour through the studios and so forth. And as one group was going through, the last man going out of my studio and into a production room next door stopped and said, "Could I have your phone number at home?" Because we didn't have listed phone numbers.
Oh.
And if you've been in radio any length of time, you know why you don't have to have those.
Yes. Yes.
But and he talked to me for a minute or two, and he told me who he was and where he was from. And I said, "Well, sure." And I gave him the phone number, and he called me that evening, and he was the manager of KLWW in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And he'd heard a bit of my show, and he heard me do a newscast, and he asked if I'd be interested in doing the morning drive news in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And I was, because money talked.
Blackhawk Communication.
It is, yes,
Yeah.
indeed. They had stations there in Waterloo and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah. So you ended up in Cedar Rapids, and I think, if I recall correctly, in addition to doing news on the radio, you also got exposure to television.
Another accident too. In Waterloo, Iowa, besides KWWL radio, they had KWWL television. And I got an ask from the manager where I was at one time. He says, "You ever do sports?" Well, in radio, you do a little bit of everything: news, weather, and sports in your program. And he said, "How about doing them on television in Cedar Rapids?" And I had not thought about that. And it wasn't permanent, just filling in for a fellow that was not there that particular weekend, I guess, whatever. And I said, "Well, I'd be happy to give it a try." And they put us up, my wife and I, up in a hotel, and they fed us and treated us really well. Plus, I got a little extra money. Drove 40 miles. And it was very nice, and I had a lot of fun. And it was, I did it 2-3 times while I was at, but I was only at Cedar Rapids. That's the shortest span in my career, was Cedar Rapids.
Well, I think you had a pretty interesting start in broadcasting,
Yes.
and it sounded like you had a pretty good time as well. I understand when you went to the small towns, you fit in pretty well.
Yeah.
Unlike a lot of the radio people I talk to, when they go to the small town, they just don't. They're kind of lonely. They don't fit in. So, you had the benefit of bringing your wife along with you as well.
I did. Well, you know what's interesting? A lot of people that have gone to small towns grew up in a big town. That's a hard thing to happen and get accustomed to. But I grew up in a little town, so everything was upscale to me.
That probably was a thought in the background when they first hired you as well.
Could be.
Look where you came from, Lisbon.
Yes.
So you're not going to be this guy that comes in for a little bit and then goes to the big city.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Curt, you've had a pretty successful career, and the thing I was thinking about here is you're in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and there must be another accident coming. And that accident must have been pretty good because you ended up at WDGY. How did that all happen?
Well, like you said, it wasn't a highway accident, but it came off the highway.
Yeah.
There was a fellow up here in the Twin Cities whom I did not know at the time by the name of Rich Holter, He and his wife were driving back from a California driving vacation to Minneapolis. And I accidentally was doing news on that Saturday morning for a fellow that was ill. Went and did his newscast. Rich Holter and his wife, driving through Cedar Rapids, were bouncing around like radio people do on the radio dial, and he caught one of my newscasts. He went the rest of the way up to Minneapolis, about 3.5 hours or 4 hours.
Sure.
And he called the station. The station called me and said, Rich Holter called you. I don't know Rich Holter. Why would I talk to him? And he said, well, he was from a station in Minneapolis called WDGY. I said, oh, I know WDGY.
Yes.
And Rich called, and I talked to him, and he said, we were driving through, I heard your newscast, I have an opening coming up, and I think you would fit just fine. Can you come up and talk to me? Mm-hmm. Following weekend, my wife and I drove to Minneapolis, had a nice long interview with Rich, and walked away with a new job. The difference is, all the way up here, because he called me from a big city, I'm important.
Yes.
I'm going to say, hey, we can do whatever we want. I'm going to ask him for $10,000 a year. How about that? I'm telling this to my wife. And she's listening, blah, blah, blah. We get up here, I go for the interview, I come back to my wife, and she says, did you ask for $10,000? I said, no. What? You told me all the way up here you were going to ask for 10. Why? I said, luckily, in that 2.5-hour interview, I listened more than I talked, and at the end of it, Rich told me he had to pay me double what I was going to ask. So there's an accident getting the job, and a better accident not saying I want 10,000.
So he who talks less tends to win, and so Rich Holter blurted out that, well, we can only start you at $20,000.
Yeah, a little bit more than that too, by the way, but it was just fine.
Yeah, I assume that you were pretty happy with that.
Oh,
And what happened to the wife? Did she come around to your side at that point?
Oh yeah, I think she started looking for credit cards. No, she didn't. But yes, she was very, very happy too, because we were both coming to Minneapolis, we were both getting closer to the Fargo-Lisbon area in North Dakota, where we both had family.
So you're hired as a newsman at WDGY.
Yes.
And that shift, I think, did it start out in the morning or did it start out in the afternoon?
Started out from 4 in the afternoon until 11 o'clock at night.
Okay.
It then went a little bit earlier. It went from noon to 7 o'clock. I started doing the afternoon drive newscasts.
Okay.
And so forth. And then early morning, mid-morning, I would cover the state capitol when it was in session, and I also covered St. Paul City Hall, police department, and the coroner's office in Ramsey County.
Exciting job at the coroner's office. But,
that was different, yes.
So I think they tried to get your stomach turned at one point with a little routine on lunch.
I think they saw a young blonde-haired Norwegian, and they decided, well, let's see what we can do with this fella. So when I was over the first time, they invited me in to where one of the autopsies had been performed and done, and there was still a body laying on a table. It was covered, and so forth. One of the coroners, I guess you could say, decided that he would take his lunchbox, put it on top, open it, and eat a sandwich. I think trying to get me to gross out, but what he didn't know is I worked on a lot of farms. The interesting part about the news at that time is that you're going out and you're bringing the news in to the station. Yes.
And it appeared that the news that you were bringing in was primarily the local news, and you would cover national news only if it was really something major, important. Otherwise, it was primarily a local newscast.
Yes, we had the United Press International wire machines in the newsroom. So if something major happened nationally, because we didn't have a radio network feeding us, then we would also include that.
Yeah. So that limited the national news in favor of the local news, which is probably, maybe there was some rationale at WDGY that was more important for their audience than the national news.
Yeah, it really was. They wanted to cover and report on information that was pertinent to Twin Cityans and so forth. and that happened. But like I said, if it was a major story nationally, we covered it as well, but with wire copy.
At that time, I think there were public affairs requirements that were issued by the FCC, Federal
Yes.
Communications Commission, and you had to meet these public affairs requirements, but you could do that through the news, I understand.
Yes, they credited news with being a public affairs program, even though you put a commercial in there. You could use that as part of your public affairs times, but we also did public affairs programming. Most of it aired early on Sunday mornings. It was recorded and aired then. Some of it on Saturday night.
Sure. I assume that management was tuned into the news since you were having the local slant of the news coverage. Even though it was a top 40 music station, they seemed to have a lot of news on there, so it must have been important to management, or somewhat important to the management.
Yeah, so we had 2 newscasts. It was called 20/20 News, 20 minutes after the hour, 20 before, and within the 3.5 minute newscast, there would be a 30 or a 1 minute commercial, and they were always full. It was always sold out.
That's interesting, and I don't think you could make that happen necessarily today, but
It'd be a tough
of
sell.
course, the radio is a lot different than it was back then,
It
too.
is.
The people that you work with at WDGY,
Yeah.
who were some of the people that were there at the time you were at the station?
They were really good people. In the newsroom, there was Rich Holter. He was the news director. Tom Kay, his real name Tom Myrie. Donald K. Martin was there.
Donald K., yes.
Another fellow by the name of Roger Huff, Hough, out of Missouri.
Okay.
Show me state type person. And then we had a couple of fill-ins that also stepped in on weekends and so forth. And they were good people, and we all had some sort of a beat to cover.
Oh yeah. Well, I've got a picture. We'll have it flashed up on screen here, but there's a picture of the old newsroom at the old WDGY studios that no longer exist today. It's now a field of apartments, I think.
Yes.
But there used to be a 9-tower antenna field out at I think 101st Street,
106.
106th Street, and
What would be
Freeway
Lindale
35.
Avenue.
Yeah. And that was I'm not sure how many acres that was, but there was a number of acres involved there, and that old building that was there. Well, it was old at that time, but it was really, I think, 1945 it was built.
I think so, yes.
So they moved in the 50,000 watt transmitter there. They moved the studios together with the transmitter, and it was I guess it was a nice looking facility, at least I thought so when I went and visited the place. And I was always impressed by that little light that they carried during the tour. You'd walk by the transmitter and they threw up the light, and this neon light would just light up. And it wouldn't have anything plugged into it. It was just held by the hand. It was lit.
It came off the RF current coming off the final tubes. And of course, everybody that went home at night glowed. We didn't need night lights at the house.
Well, I remember Donald J. Martin, who I interviewed a few years back before he died, mentioned that he did a tour on occasion, and he held up the light, and he was always wondering, well, if it does that to the light, what's it doing to me? So he was a little concerned about that, I guess.
It was really interesting. Believe it or not, what was enough to light that fluorescent tube was not really enough to do much damage to you, unless you wanted to stand right in front of it all the time.
Yeah. You had some names there on the news side that you covered. Who were some of the DJs that were there at that time that you were doing news?
Yeah, they were very well known. Early morning was B. Mason Dean, the Morning Grouch. And then there was Scott Burton, Johnny Canton, George Young, overnights. DGY stands for Dr. George Young, by the way.
Yes.
And he was there, and they were really good disc jockeys, all of them. Harry Scarborough, he came out of San Francisco radio, and you could tell. Very hippie looking.
Oh, okay.
Nice guy.
Who were some of the nicest guys that were working there versus more of the eccentric personalities that were at the station at that time?
There were some different peoples. B. Mason Dean in the morning, they called him the Morning Grouch. He was on early in the morning, and he had a little contest at one time that girls could send him a postcard with their phone number, and at a little bit after 7 in the morning, if he drew their card out, he'd give them a call, wake them up, just a wake-up call. And it was kind of neat, and he'd pull out a card every morning and he would dial that number, and Susie or whoever on the other end would answer with a tired sound like, hello. He said, Susie, yeah, this is B. Mason Dean, WDGY. Oh, yeah. Don't ever send another card in here. I've woke you up now. Stay awake. And he'd click and hang up the phone on the air. And the mail would fill up with more postcards the next day. It was just amazing. So they did some really neat things, and the disc jockeys knew how to play it really, really well.
Tell us about some interesting stories about one of the eccentric DJs there that we haven't talked about, Jim Dandy.
Jim Dandy was a dandy. He was a big fella, and he enjoyed food. And in the disc jockey studio, they had this huge, expensive, wonderful microphone for the jocks to use and so forth. And it had, we called him a muff, a wind muff, wind screen in the business. That was so that if you indeed were outside and wind came by, it wouldn't whistle in there. It would just, the muff would literally dampen it. That's also, you could be used that way when your mouth was within inches of it, and because everybody breathes out when they talk and so forth, and it can create another little wind, if you will, so they put the muff on it. Well, Jim had a tendency to enjoy a lot of food while he was on the air. In doing so, when he talked, maybe with a lot of food yet in his mouth, that little windscreen thing got full of food, or parts of food, something. It wasn't pretty at the end of his shift. And George Young came on after him. First time he sat down there after Jim was off the air, he looked at that windscreen and he didn't even want to come close to the microphone. So he yelled at Jim before he could leave, saying, "This is yours, take it with you." And Jim did, and then George got the station to buy some more windscreens.
I do remember George Young, midnight, I think, was 6 in the morning?
5 or 6, yes.
He seemed to be a nice guy.
They all were really nice guys. Like I said, Jim had a little eccentricity with how he sat in the studio and talked, but it didn't hurt anybody.
Well, Jim is no longer with us, I understand.
No, there's an awful lot of them that are gone. Scott Burton's gone, Johnny Canton's gone.
Yeah. It's time takes its toll.
It does.
The one thing I was going to ask you also about WDGY was maybe some of your most memorable experiences with the station at the news at that time.
I didn't have a lot of news experience, obviously, when I was there. I was only about 6 to 7 months in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which was all news. But one night I left, George Young had just come on for the overnight, and I'd left the station and I went back to the apartment. My wife's in my apartment, and as soon as I got in there, the phone rang again, and it was George. He says, "You got to come back to the station right now because Robert Kennedy has been shot in Los Angeles." I said, "Yeah, right," because we used to pull phone stunts on each other all the time, and I hung up the phone. Well, it rang again, a few seconds later, and George says, "Don't hang up, it's true." So I did turn right around, head back into the station, got there, started doing reports, so on and so forth. And because I was used to reporting and searching for news too, I picked up our phone and I called the, I think, Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and the desk clerk answered, and you can imagine the mayhem that was going on in that hotel. I asked for Robert Kennedy's suite, and she put me through. I did identify myself as being from the news industry in Minneapolis. And she put me through, and a young lady who had obviously been crying, was still kind of crying and sobbing, answered the phone. I identified myself again, and I said, "What happened, and do they have anybody in custody? Do you know anybody?" And through tears and everything else, she mentioned the name Surin, and so on and so forth a couple of times, and then she hung up. And so on. Well, I taped that, obviously, put it in my next newscast on WDGY.
So you played that on the air?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Because it wasn't me saying that, it was somebody else there saying it, so it was actual news story. And it couldn't have been 20 minutes after I aired it, I got another phone call in there. This was from the FBI in Minneapolis.
Uh-oh.
A nice agent called me and said, "Did you air this, and was this name mentioned?" I said, "Yes, it was." He said, "Please don't air it again. I have to come right out there and pick up that tape." And he was out there in a half hour or something like that. I didn't air it again and so forth. And he said, "That name is close to what we think is correct, but we haven't finalized it." And so forth. And as he was leaving, 5-10 minutes later, he said, "Did you manage to make a copy for yourself?" I said, "I did. You have the copy. I have the original."
Okay.
And he said, "We'll notify you when you can air it." So that was pretty interesting. And it was
Yeah.
it was scary to me too, because I was interrupting in that room, and that lady was crying and sobbing and trying to talk, and oof, it affected me as well.
Yeah, interesting. The other thing I was going to check with you on is the old rivalry between KDWB and WDGY. I'm assuming that was in full force and effect during the time you were at the station.
Oh yes, it really was. We counter-programmed news. They did news as well. We did ours at 20 after and 20 before the hour. They did theirs, I think, at 55 and 30, 25 or something like that, so that we wouldn't be running news when we would have a rock and roll record on the air, which is what 90% of our both audiences wanted to hear.
Yeah.
But it worked out just fine, and we'd run across KDWB people all the time, and they us at different places, and we were all good friends. It was a rivalry on the air, but we were all good friends.
Well, I seem to remember as I'm driving in the car, having a push-button radio, music come on WDGY,
Bingo.
yeah, flip over to KDWB, and
Yes.
vice versa.
Yeah, they shortened up their news. For a while, they had 5-minute newscasts.
Oh.
We had 3.5.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think they looked at the success of 3.5, and they went to 3.5 as well.
The story in fewer words.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that kind of explains the 2020 shift from doing it at 55 minutes on the
25,
hour
yeah.
and 25. So that's kind of consistent, logical, I guess.
Yes.
From the standpoint of the
Just
push-button radio.
counter-programming.
What about? I'm not sure if you had any interest in the music side of it, but there was a shift at one time to the much more music format, which was the Drake format.
Drake Chenault, yes.
Do you recall much about that, or just that it happened?
Well, mainly just because I wasn't involved with the music side of it hardly at all. But yes, it just happened there. But they tried to run segments of music without commercial interruption. Then instead of just running a commercial right after a record, then a commercial, blah, 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 they would run 3 or 4 records in a row and play a commercial, or 2,
Yeah.
or 3. They were getting the same amount of commercial time. It didn't sound like it is all.
Yeah.
And most of both KDWB and WDGY's commercials had to do with teenagers, soda pops,
Sure.
Brill cream, pimple lotion,
Yeah.
whatever it might be.
I recall most of those commercials had some rock music in there anyway, so it
Very
was like,
likely.
you were listening to the radio, some more music, Okay.
Oh, yes.
So
Yeah.
it wasn't that much of a burden to listen to some of those commercials. The Coca-Cola song, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Pepsi Generation song, so it was okay. Was there any discussion of what the future impact of FM was destined to be at WDGY? Did you guys get into any discussions about FM versus AM?
No, well, the little bit that there was from management in particular, or Stores Corporation that owned all the 6 stations around the states, was that is elevator music. It's only going to just lay there. Anybody that puts on an FM station is just going to do it because they have the license.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, they learned differently down the road, but back then, FM wasn't even a thought.
Well, it was kind of interesting because I was working at KTCR FM, which is now the current KTCZ FM, different ownership and different format. I was working at KTCR FM when it was country. And I remember the Tedescos who owned the station.
Yes.
They bought that station. It was formerly KW FM. So it was KW FM.
Yes.
They changed the call letters to KTCR FM and put country on.
Ah,
And I think their concept was, well, things are changing. It's going to go more toward FM, and eventually the FM did take over the ratings of the AM station.
Yes, yeah.
So it was interesting I was there at the time.
Those that got in early made a good move.
Yeah, although they paid really poorly.
So welcome to radio.
So I didn't get any benefit of that, other than I was able to talk on the radio in Minneapolis. That was a big deal for me at that time.
Well, it's a big market.
Yeah. But it's kind of interesting. The other thing I was going to ask you before we get off of WDGY is, why did you leave WDGY? What caused that happen? Was that another accident?
No, there was an accident to me, but not to the station. They had sold the station, I think, to Mallrite. I don't remember the corporation, and they were going to go country music with it. And they didn't want a newsroom. And we had 5 people in a rock and roll newsroom in a major city. That was major. And so forth. And I was the last one to leave there. It wasn't a shock to me. We knew it was coming in one at a time. People were let go and so on. And so when I left there, I went over to KSTP AM radio and did Saturday and Sunday mornings, 5 hours in the morning, all news in the morning. With a fellow by the name of J.B. Eckert, good fella.
Yeah.
And so forth. And I'd met a lot of people at that time, including a photographer at Channel 11, which is where I think you're going to go down the road here.
Well,
but they...
that was my next question was your transition from WDGY to TV at Channel 11. But
this photographer I met by accident one day at lunch while I was doing the KSTP stuff and so forth. And he said, would you be interested in television? And I hadn't ever given it a thought. And television news, and so forth. And it would be as a reporter, not just an anchor, although I did some of that work too, down the road. And I said, well, yeah, I don't really have but a weekend job, if you will, right now. And they said, well, when Metro Media finalizes the sale, the news director there, Gil Amundsen, was interested in talking to me because Doug had talked to him about me. And a few months later, I was at Channel 11, WTCN back then.
Yeah, WTCN, now WUSA, but you had a different ownership at that time, Metro Media, than the current ownership.
Yep.
The interesting thing is your shift from radio to television. Was that a kind of a easy thing for you to do?
No,
not
at all. I didn't know how to play to the camera as a reporter. The people on TV, reporters, do stand-ups at the end of stories or at the opening of a story to establish for the station and the viewer that they are on location. It's just simply called a stand-up. Sometimes a stand-up at the end is just, I'm John Doe for such and such station. You're all done. But you put you on the location and so forth. I did not know how to address that camera. I could write documentaries and narrate them and so forth, and we'd go out and shoot them. I wouldn't be on camera unless I needed to be for a certain story, and I was more comfortable with that.
Did you ever get more comfortable along the way, or was it just totally uncomfortable for you?
As a reporter, it was still uncomfortable to be on camera and do. I didn't mind doing the interview because I was going to be edited anyhow, but it was still uncomfortable. But the documentaries that I did for Metro Media, they turned out very well.
Yeah, and those went on their network of TV stations, so that was not just in the Minneapolis area, it was their whole network.
Yeah, they had 6 stations around the U.S., including New York City, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Miami, Houston, Washington, D.C. too.
And speaking of Washington, I think one of your documentaries that was well received was the Happy Warrior.
That was really, really well received all over the place. In fact, after it aired on the Metro Media stations, I think twice or 3 times in the following week, they sold off some of the information that we had because we had some exclusive stuff to, I think, NBC. They got to use some of it.
Let's stop for just a second and let people know what the Happy Warrior documentary was.
Yeah, that was the life of Hubert H. Humphrey. And I'd covered Hubert Humphrey since I started in '67 with WDGY radio. And you don't have to agree with all of his politics, that's up to the individual, but boy could he tell a story. And it was fabulous just to listen to the man and his experience and so forth. Plus he was a good-hearted person. I really liked that. And so forth. So we did the documentary on him. We had a lot of footage on him over the years. And as he became ill in the last couple of years when he was in Washington and vice president, I started assembling video and writing script to lead into each piece and so forth over his period of years. So by the time, unfortunately, when he died, the day of his funeral, we were there. We shot a couple of things with Walter Mondale at the time at the funeral. We didn't, because I don't like that type of interview, we didn't do anything with Muriel Humphrey other than show her at the funeral. I don't like interrupting that type and at that point anybody's privacy and so forth. But within an hour and a half, we had filled out the last, I think, 8 minutes of that documentary, had 6 copies made, and on first-class airplane tickets to all of the Metro media stations. So by supper time anywhere in the United States, that documentary was running.
Gee, yeah. Well, I do remember the production teacher at Brown Institute, Henry Debussy, I think, or Debussy.
I remember the name. Yeah.
He had a story about Humphrey that kind of stuck with me, which is a short story, but I guess he was at a radio station and they had to record some commercials because he was on the campaign trail and they wanted to record some commercials at the production room. Unfortunately, the air conditioning was off. And he's there sweating like a pig, and naturally Hubert was also sweating. But the one thing he always remembered about that situation was at the end of it, Humphrey reaches into his pocket, pulls out a $5 bill and hands it to him. He thought that was really nice.
All right. Yeah.
So I guess that kind of attests to your story that he was a really nice guy too.
Well, I also got a call from him one day because he said, I was at WDGY at this point, and he said, I understand you were with my wife yesterday. I said, as a matter of fact, Senator, I was. His wife Muriel was in charge of what they used to have as a Honey Sunday charity thing to raise money for a children's hospital. And it was little bears that looked like little jars looked like a bear, and it was full of honey. And she was the chairperson of that charity. And she had called me at WDGY. I don't know that Hubert ever listened to me on Ouija, but she apparently did, and asked if I would co-voice Honey Sunday commercials with her. So we went down to WCCO radio studios.
Did the recording?
Spent the afternoon or a couple of hours recording. So that was his threat, that I was with his wife.
Let's talk about maybe the one of the last accidents of your career, which was your job working for the state of Minnesota, Governor Ventura, Jesse Ventura at the time. How did that come about?
Well, I was at the Minnesota News Network, and I'd been there, I think I was with them a total of 13 or 14 years, something like that. And a fellow that was media relations person for the Explore Minnesota Tourism, that time Minnesota Office of Tourism, was retiring, and he was a friend of mine, and he called me one day at M&N and said, come on over and talk to the director that I ended up hiring out to down the road, because my job's coming open. So I went over and talked to him and so forth, to an underling of his who became my immediate boss when I went over there. And we went to have lunch. We were going to have about 15, 20 minutes because it was an informational interview on my part. Well, we spent about 2 hours talking and drank about 4 pots of coffee. Got along very, very well and so forth. And we got down to, well, I think you would be a good hire, but I have others to talk to because we have to go through all the lists. It's a state job, right? And so forth, so I will get back to you. I said, well, wait a minute, hold on, before you do that, what's the pay? And I won't tell you the dollars, but he told me, and I said, no, I make more than that where I am. Why would I change? My job wasn't threatened at M&N. So I just went home. No word, no word, no word. Probably close to 2 months went by, and I was back on my deck one Friday and having a nice adult beverage in the sun, and my cell phone rang, and it was the fellow from tourism. He said, are you still interested? I said, well, we discussed that, and we discussed pay, and I said no. He said, how about if I get there? It's union too in state jobs. steps and grades, blah, blah, blah. How about if I get you to this grade and this step or whatever? And they told me the dollar figure, and I said, oh, righty. Tell you what, you put that down on a piece of paper, type it out, sign it, date it, fax it to me at home. I'll sign it, fax it back to you. We now have a contract and so forth, and we'll get it done right now. I said, well, why? We can do this on Monday or Tuesday. I said, no. I would like to get it done right now on Friday because my boss at the network, the president, is still in his office.
Oh, okay.
I want it on his desk because I want to give him 2 weeks' notice.
Yeah.
And the fellow tourism said, well, you said you needed 3 weeks. I said, I do. 2 weeks' notice so I don't walk out on a job. The
1
third
week off for yourself?
1 week fishing in Montana.
Yeah.
And I went fishing in Montana. So it was another accident in a way.
Okay. Well, that was work for the Department of Tourism for the
Yes.
state, and you had to probably interact with Jesse Ventura in that position as well.
Yes, a lot. Anything he did with, especially with outdoors that would promote tourism, I was involved in the media side of it. Yeah.
Any juicy stories you can tell us about Ventura?
Oh yes, but I'm not. I'm going to. He was good to work with. We did have a discussion one time, just he and I, shooting the breeze and so forth. I won't go into a lot of details and so forth, but he had that huge voice. He was a big guy.
Yeah.
And in fact, my head came up to his armpit. It was that big. But he says, how come people are mad at me a lot? I said, well, now, he's not dumb. He surrounded himself with some of the finest people in politics, both Republican, Democrat, and Independent. Got a lot done in 3 of his 4 years. Fourth year he wasn't going to run, so nobody was going to give him anything over there.
Okay.
And so forth. I said, Governor, you're a good guy. I've known you since you were wrestling over at Channel 11 when I was there doing booth announcing and so forth. But your ego and your verbiage sometimes gets in the way of people wanting to accept you just for the good person you actually are.
Yeah.
And so, really? I said, yeah, you can get pretty harsh. You don't mean to be, but you can get pretty harsh. And that can be taken wrong right away, and then that's coming back at you.
Sounds like somebody else I know. Currently. More on the national level. But,
Yeah.
The job there at the state was a good job while you had that one.
It really was. There were good people to work with, and I got to work with the tourism people all over the state for the governor's fishing openers. They used to get about 12 or 18 media up to the opener. It's a big event for Minnesota tourism, by the way, each year. And when I went over there, my immediate boss, Bob Erler, said, well, we'd like to get more than 12 to 18 media there. So, well, how many? He said, well, I don't know. You just get more. And I said, okay, let me make some calls, because I'd met people all over this country and in a few foreign countries. And I went back in a couple, 3 days, and I said, could you handle 25? So I'm sure we can. It's a resort that puts you up. It's all righty. And about a week or 2 weeks later, and I said, how about 50? Is 50 going to work for you? I said, well, we'll make it work. The first one I had was 109 people from 3 countries and all over the United States, getting publicity for Minnesota's outdoors.
Well, the last question I had to ask you about your positions was, did you enjoy TV or radio more?
Radio. But I enjoyed television documentaries. I wrote them, edited them, narrated them. I liked that. But that, was radio for me. We put pictures to the script I wrote.
Yeah.
So I really, really enjoyed radio. But all of broadcasting to me from 1964 on, I consider a gift. Because a lot of things happened that I didn't know were going to happen that benefited me.
Someone gave me a question to ask you, and it goes like this. How does the current state of political correctness affect writing and content of news today, so that reporting can be accurate without the public accusing the station of taking sides?
Yeah. It's hard to do, as you know, if you write anything. Put it down on a typewriter and then you're going to read it, or somebody else is going to read it. Just the way you inflect reading a story affects the meaning at times and can slant it, but depending upon what you highlight, what you pause after, and so forth. That's just a part of broadcast. It's going to happen. So you try to write as neutral as you can in a news story, which is, again, impossible, but you can make it very, very good and clean. The best thing to do is source it. So don't create a line in a story. Have someone, a newsmaker, an authority within that story, tell you that line.
Yeah.
Now it becomes sourced.
Yeah.
And with all of the internet information available all over the place, there's probably, in any given day, there's probably 100 versions of a single story on the internet worldwide.
Yeah.
And if you looked at, because you hear the word fake news an awful lot lately, and I hate to hear that word, although some of it is, if you look at the major networks in the United States, the top ones that have been around for the last 60 to 70 years, you'll find out in most cases their stories are sourced within the story. If it's sourced within the story and you still don't want to believe it, that's up to you, but at least you know you could go to that person or that source and try to check it yourself.
Yeah. Well, I understand that. I remember when I was reading the news at the radio station I worked at, I think I was guilty of a few pauses and intonations that may have slanted the story at that time.
Well, I guess you're the only one in the world that ever did that.
I probably.
Oh no, wait a minute! Everybody did that. You didn't do it meaningfully in most cases.
Well, not most cases, no. Sometimes it was, but
Yes.
the story was just so outrageous to me when I was reading it, I just couldn't believe it. But those aren't the typical story that you're dealing with.
There's a line that was used in a TV show, and I won't mention it, but it was really, really interesting because it's been used unknowingly by people in broadcast radio especially, is that the most important thing you can do to get attention in what you're telling somebody is to pause.
Ah, there's the pause
They
right
will
there.
pay attention.
My last question is changes, good or bad. The industry has changed so much in the last 35 years. Can you reflect on good and bad changes, or is it all bad? What's your position on this?
There is some bad, but the good, with regard to news especially, the good I think is just phenomenal. If you remember back, if nothing else, just reading in history books and broadcast journalism and so on and so forth, when we were covering, when journalists were covering the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the stories from there about American troops and people and so forth took days to get back here. It was shot on videotape, or not videotape, but film. It was processed, it was sent back, it was edited, scripts had to arrive, blah, blah, blah. It could take you days to hear a story about what happened in Vietnam at supper time, and so on and so forth. Now, with the internet and satellite delivery and so forth, you can have a story from anywhere in the world within, I think the maximum is about 28 seconds. If once you get it up on the satellite and have it come back down here again. So that part is good as far as getting it. What isn't necessarily so good is the internet and satellite and news information by the second and so forth. Is there so much of it from so many different sources? And in my mind, what that does is give you a chance to be polluted. You the viewer, the listener, the reader, to be polluted, because there's so much out there to read on the same story and which one is the most true. I like network news today, television network news and radio news right now, because they usually source their story. It gives you the best chance of saying, oh yes, they didn't make it up and write it. Somebody that was pertinent to the story told them. That makes a difference. So it's been good and bad. Good because we can get the delivery right now. Secondly, bad because there's so many different versions of the same story.
Well, I'm assuming also that the time sensitivity may also give some reporters an opportunity to jump the gun a little bit before they get all the facts.
Yes. Sometimes they're being called on if they're on a remote location and you need it on the air in the next 7.5 minutes. And you don't have all the information, well, you're going to assume. I hate that word, but you're going to assume. when you're doing news, you shouldn't assume. You should get the story and report it.
Yeah. Well, Curt, it's been really fun for me at least, and I'm sure for our audience that views this broadcast, to hear about the old days, hear about the beginnings and your successes along the way. And I appreciate you taking the time here to sit down with me. And I'm just thinking about back when I was in high school, listening to you on the radio, listening to other people on the radio. I never really thought, because I'm such a small person in broadcasting, kind of negligible for what I did, I never thought I'd be able to sit down next to some people and interview them and share their stories. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do this.
Well, I appreciate being able to do it with you, but you did notice that first he made me feel old, then he made me feel good. But I appreciate it, Rick, very much.
It's the good and bad. One and the same person, though. I'm not the good guy, bad guy thing.
I really do appreciate it. I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. And we'll end our broadcast here. And I thank everybody for watching. I think you learned a lot today. Thanks.